Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Is there a new Cold War brewing pitting the West against Russia? What has been called a reset in relations at the start of the Obama presidency today is in tatters. Western media and politicians are determined to portray Russia in the worst possible light, even to the point of undermining the Sochi Games. What are these new Cold Warriors hoping to achieve? To cross-talk whether there is a new Cold War, I'm joined by my guest, Stephen Cohen in New York. He is a professor emeritus of Russian studies at New York University and author of Soviet Fates in Lost Alternatives, that currently is out in paperback from Columbia University Press. Also in New York, we have Eric Draitser. He is a geopolitical analyst and founder of StopImperialism.org. And in London, we cross to Mark Aumann. He is a modern history lecturer at the University of Oxford. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Stephen Cohen, if I go to you first in New York, when you hear the term New Cold War, because it's part of your title of your most recent book, what does it mean to you and what should it mean to our viewers?
Well, it means I don't know whether we're in a new Cold War or a continuation of the old Cold War. And it doesn't really matter whether we call it a Cold War or not. But the conflicts, the dangers, the issues, the confrontations that characterize the 40-year Cold War between the United States and Russia and the West are back. And in some ways, it's different, and in some ways, it's even more dangerous. Just to bring this right into this week's news, this new Cold War may now be drawing the dividing line, which was in Berlin, right on Russia's borders in Ukraine. But this is a process that's been going on since the end of the Soviet Union, nearly 22 years now.
Eric in New York, how do you reflect upon that? Because I want to talk about Ukraine a little bit later in the program, but if you read Western media right now, I mean, it's gotten to the point of hysteria, absolute hysteria. The Economist, the Washington Post, never friends of Russia, but in this week alone, this is getting to going to proportions that I've never, ever seen, even during the Cold War, I would say.
Well, I think that the timing is instructive, of course. The Sochi Games, the triumphal sort of procession for Russia on the world stage, they're attempting to undermine that, of course. As we all know, the Olympics is not merely an athletic event. It's not merely a two-week extravaganza. It's also a corporate event. It is an attempt for any country, in this case Russia, to sort of parade itself on the world stage as being a haven for investment, as having made tremendous strides in terms of infrastructure, as having moved forward economically, socially, politically. So part of the propaganda, I think, that you're alluding to in the Western media is an attempt to delegitimize that as much as possible. Of course, the Edward Snowden issue and many others are kind of lurking in the background of all of this, using the various political issues, political conflicts as sort of a pretext for launching into the vehement Russia bashing, which I think to a large degree we've grown accustomed to. And, you know, Ukraine is also very important in all of this, but I think it's also very significant that we recognize that unlike in the sort of technical Cold War of the post-World War II period, we have a tremendous amount of economic cooperation between Russia and the West. Of course, primarily we're thinking of mutually beneficial economic arrangements between Gazprom, Rosneft, and Western oil companies, whether in the Arctic or elsewhere. We see a tremendous amount of money and resources poured into bilateral arrangements between Russia and various countries such as Turkey and others, which are traditionally in the sort of Western NATO sphere of influence. So although we do see a freezing of these relations, it is something that is much more nuanced than simply a Cold War. It's interesting, Mark. It's not to undermine Russia per se, but the political order that is here today. This is what it's really all about, is to undermine the popular leader, and his name is Vladimir Putin. If you like him or not, he's popular here.
Well, he's been made into the bogeyman, certainly. But I think if we go back to what Stephen Cohen was saying, that process of the retreat to Moscow, which has been going on since the end of the Cold War, since the Glasnost period, is something which the West wishes to push through. And if we think about the classic Cold War, we can see, I think, continuities but important differences. In the Cold War period, we had the argument that the Soviet Union was a one-party dictatorship, but it also was a socialist society, fundamentally different from the capitalist states in the US alliance. And the argument was that you couldn't really have political freedom unless you had economic freedom. now, of course, Russia in some ways is a more capitalist society than many of the West European countries that join up with the United States to criticise it. It has a flat tax and so on. So we've seen that a core propaganda or ideological argument has disappeared, and yet the Russophobia, the anti-Russian mood, which was also an underpinning of the Cold War, has become, if anything, stronger. And I think in a way, therefore, if we think about the Cold War, we can see, if you're British, for instance, Britain had been an imperial rival of Imperial Russia, and it saw the Soviet Union as simply the Tsarist Empire with a red flag on top of it. And the desire of the Western states to push back Russian power is very strong. 100 years ago, the British went to war with Germany, but their Foreign Office was saying, in the 1920s, of course, Russia will be the main enemy. They didn't anticipate then a revolution, but they expected that a defeat of Germany would bring Russian power towards Central Europe. That happened, of course, under the guise of the Red Army and so on in 1945. And today we're seeing, if you like, a revival of an essentially anti-Russian mood. And we play, therefore, upon the nationalisms of neighbouring states, the Baltic states, the Poles, the Ukrainians and so on. And rather, as I'm afraid to say, in the Second World War, the Germans eventually tried to recruit anti-communist, anti-Russian Balts and Ukrainians to fight for them. We, in a sense, are now reviving those ghosts of collaboration of 70 years ago. And I think this is a rather rancid and distasteful policy, but also one that's dangerous for the goal which we're supposed to be pursuing of democratization, as well as a threat to creating a kind of civil conflict within places like Ukraine between the pro and anti-Russians, between the greater Europeans, if you like, and the so-called Eurasianists.
Okay, Stephen, is Russia a threat to the West? Because the West certainly portrays Russia as some kind of threat.
I would put it differently.
All right.
I would say that the West has become a threat to itself. This constant confrontation with Russia, which began in the 1990s with the end of the Soviet Union, the kind of march toward Moscow from the West, beginning with NATO expansion, carrying on with the attempt to establish an American military outpost in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, the building of missile defense installations along Russia's borders, and now the confrontation in Ukraine. In my perspective, that is not only highly provocative, but it is closing down opportunities that we have with Russia to solve major problems affecting our own national security in Syria, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in the struggle against international terrorism. The problem today is, whether we call it a Cold War or not, as I said at the beginning, is that in some ways it's more dangerous. One reason is there's no discussion of this issue in the United States on network radio or television. Yeah. During the Cold War, we had a debate about in this country. What should we do about it? Should we seek détente, increasing cooperation, or should we seek more Cold War? Today, it's one hand clapping in the media and in Washington. So what we say today on your show, Peter, if it's heard in the United States, will be dismissed as Russian propaganda. I know. Even though I'm a patriotic American, because it's coming on a Russian television network. The problem is, how do you get this conversation underway in the United States so that we can bring those politicians in Washington who once were against Cold War, against this new reckless set of American and European policies? That's the real problem today. As events that unfold move closer and closer, more dangerously, recklessly, I would say, toward Russia itself.
You know, Eric, it seems like it's a bad habit that has to be broken, because I would say it's a continuation of the original Cold War.
Yeah, I think that it could be seen that way as well. But I would add, I would agree with everything that Mr. Cullen said, but I would add another point here, and that there are very real material and economic reasons for launching this continued Russophobia in popular culture. I think one of the main reasons is Russian dominance of the European gas market. I think the North Stream and the South Stream pipeline have been seen as a tremendous threat by many corporations in the West and the Western ruling class more broadly, because they understand that it is a way for Russia to cement itself as a vital part of the European economic future. So for that reason alone, they've done what they can to undermine that. Of course, we see various machinations with regard to pipeline development in the Caspian region as a means of kind of undercutting Russian dominance. Of course, the demonization of Russia's relationship with Belarus and the Ukrainian government as well, because they both are vital to the Russian gas delivery infrastructure. I think that Syria is very much a part of this same issue as well, related not only to the prospective pipeline going to Europe, but also to the traditional Russian sphere of influence and Russia's final remaining ally in the Middle East, and of course the Russian base at Tartus. I think that there are a lot of very practical political and geopolitical and strategic reasons for why you see this ramping up of this Russophobia, of the Putin bashing, Cold War rhetoric, whatever you want to call it. And if you see it in that way, it only begins to make sense. And of course, Obama and the Obama administration, which came into office under the guise of
Eric, let me go to Mark here, real quick before the break. Let me go to London here. But it doesn't work, does it, Mark? Okay, because Russia continues down its path. This is what I find really interesting. For a decade, Russia is going to collapse, but it doesn't happen.
You see, one of the fundamental psychological changes that's taken place is I used to, in the 1980s, be a foot soldier of the Cold War, bringing money and fax machines and computer bits and pieces to dissidenti. And you never met in the Soviet bloc somebody who was anti-Western, anti-American. But today,
yes,
the disillusionment with the New World Order, the disillusionment with the economic and social catastrophe, which has hit many of these countries, so great. Remember, we're told Poland is a model. Poland is booming, but 3.5 to 4 million Poles have fled the country to work in the West. In the Cold War, the Berlin Wall was there to keep them in, and we were told, what kind of system is it that if it took away walls, people would flee in vast numbers? Well, they do still. And so we have this fundamental
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on whether there is a new Cold War. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing whether there is a new Cold War. Okay, Stephen, I'd like to go back to you in New York. This week here, Timothy Snyder wrote in the Washington Post, "Don't let Putin grab Ukraine." You made a mention of that to my producer. I did read that. That's a truly disturbing article in the Washington Post. Would you explain why you thought it was as well?
Well, let me correct you. It wasn't in the Washington Post. It was in the International Herald Tribune, which is owned by the New York Times.
It was in both. It was in both.
Yeah. Well, that's quite remarkable in itself. I mean, bear in mind that Snyder is an eminent professor of history at Yale. And we may see this kind of reckless, inflammatory, unfactual writing in newspapers and in magazines. But for a professor to say that shows you just how deep is the new Cold War. Because what Snyder is saying, or warning against, is the possibility that after the Olympics, when the world's gaze is averted from Russia, Putin may carry out a military takeover of Ukraine, and that the West therefore has to be ready. He's talking about war, actual war, not Cold War, but hot war. For this allegation, he has absolutely no facts whatsoever, and yet it's published. It is in an eminent place, and because he's a Yale professor, presumably many readers take it seriously, and that is exceedingly dangerous.
Eric, how do you reflect on it? Because I read that article and I found it inflammatory to the extreme. I mean, there's no evidence to support any contention that Russia would do anything to harm Ukraine at all. As a matter of fact, it's loaned it a lot of money to get through a rough patch.
I think it also, we should add that it plays on certain ignorance in the West and in the United States particularly about what Ukraine is. Ukraine is a divided country. I mean, we have a tremendous proportion of the population that identifies very closely with Russians, that they have family in Russia, that they are, that they consider themselves, if not Russians, but certainly very close. Of course, the West and the East are decidedly different, but even in the so-called anti-Russian West, you have a divided population. But the idea, at least in the public consciousness in the United States, is that Russia is an imperial power, that Russia wants to take over the Ukraine and reestablish and reconstitute the Soviet Union, which is, of course, an absurdity. Ukraine and Russia are economic partners. Ukraine is integral to the Russian energy delivery infrastructure, and conversely, Ukrainian industry is very much dependent upon Russian energy and Russian investment. So all of these nuances to that relationship are, of course, completely ignored solely for the purposes of making Putin into the bad guy, the Russians into the big bad former Soviet Union, and making it the responsibility of the West to swoop in on their, proverbial white horse and save the Ukrainians.
Mark, how do you reflect upon what's going on in Ukraine? Go ahead, Stephen, jump in. Please go ahead. Please do.
What Eric says is completely true, but then it poses a question. Everybody has known for decades that Ukraine is at least two different countries, one leaning toward the West, Poland and Lithuania, one toward Russia. It's been a ticking political time bomb for decades. The question is, who provoked this current political civil war in Ukraine, which may be the most fateful international development underway? The blame has been placed in the West on Ukrainian President Yanukovych and Putin. But the reality is, this was triggered when the European Union issued an ultimatum to the democratically elected president of Ukraine, whether we like him or not, Yanukovych, that he had to choose between Russia and the West. Why did he have to choose? At that moment, Putin said, whether you like him or not, look, why force Ukraine to choose? For all the reasons that Eric just mentioned, Ukraine is a divided country. Let's have a tripartite relationship. Russia will help Ukraine economically. The European Union will help Ukraine economically. But the European Union rejected that. It told Ukraine you must choose between East and West. And we used to call that Cold War.
Okay, Mark, how do you reflect upon the events going on in Ukraine? Go ahead, jump in.
Yeah. You see, I think we've got to see that Russia has been thinking about these things economically as well as culturally, and the Europeans and the Americans think about them geopolitically.
Yes.
Russia has offered economic aid which would cut the price of gas and energy to ordinary Ukrainians. The European Union today, Barroso has said there'll be no bargaining. We are giving tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions to buy the political class. Russia is prepared to give 15 billion to subsidise the society. The problem is the political class, or a significant part of it, decides the fate of a country. And so we've done this in other countries too. We have found it easier and cheaper to buy a class of political leaders and media people rather than to subsidise the population. Hence we've seen, since the collapse of communism, dwindling economic conditions, mass migration to the West. And for instance, I don't myself think the West wants to divide Ukraine, because we don't want the Western Ukraine, which is bumpkin country, poverty-stricken peasants. We want the Crimea, we want the coast, we want the geostrategic hub of the Russian Navy. And so a peaceful way out of this crisis might be to say, well, the people in the Western Ukraine seem to be fantasizing about becoming part of Europe, even though the people in Eastern Poland could tell them it's not a way paved with gold. And the people in the East and the South seem to be more happy with Russia. Why not say that the country is artificial, it doesn't really exist or function as a single society or nation? But the West doesn't want that, because we want to get closer to the jugular of Russian military power. Because, as we've been saying, essentially we've been seeing a retreat to Moscow, and I fear, as Henry Kissinger said about Britain in 1982, no empire retreats forever. He said that about Britain and Argentina. I fear that we could stumble into a crisis with Russia because we have got used to the idea that ultimately the Russians blink. Well, what if they don't?
Well, I'll tell you, Eric, Russians don't blink as much as you think, okay? And I live here, and I'll tell you, a lot of people have had enough of this nonsense being played out on the streets of Kiev being egged on by the European Union. It's quite disgusting, to say the least. I agree with Mark. We could see hopefully nothing military, but it will become more of a confrontation of words. That's for sure. Go ahead, Eric in New York. Jump in.
Well, I would agree with that, but I would also add that the military angle is an important one. Look, we have a historical precedent. If you see what the United States and the NATO powers did in the Balkans in the late 90s and in the early part of the previous decade, you begin to see that there is a sort of a strategy here. Whether or not they want to make the west of Ukraine into a grand-scale Kosovo may be somewhat of an oversimplification, but certainly making it into essentially a de facto NATO protectorate as they did in Kosovo. And of course, you can see today the tremendous costs, social, political, and economic costs of that sort of policy. If you ask anybody living in Kosovo, or for that matter, many of the former Soviet republics, because of the way in which the Soviet Union was dismantled, because of the way in which the Western powers moved into Eastern Europe. And so Ukraine is in many ways a battleground, certainly a battleground of words and economic battleground, but militarily speaking as well. We shouldn't forget that right before, on the eve of the Beijing Olympics, the Georgia-Russia war, or rather the Georgia war in South Ossetia, began. And it was precisely at that moment that the world, many people around the world, finally realized what Georgia had become: a forward arm of NATO, a de facto colony of the Western imperial forces. And of course, I don't mean to oversimplify it, but the west of Ukraine could be headed in that direction, particularly if you look at the economic statistics in the west of Ukraine, which is tremendously underdeveloped with rampant unemployment and serious problems of poverty. That is what is being played upon, and certainly by the extreme right wing in Ukraine.
Stephen, do you buy into the NATO angle? Because I think it's absolutely true. If you look at the association agreement, it does talk about military and security relations with Brussels. That's a back door.
This so-called economic partnership agreement that the EU has offered Ukraine is discussed in the West solely as an economic, and I put it in quotes, civilizational choice. But you're absolutely right. The 1,000-page document includes a whole section on military provisions, which, if I read them correctly, bind Ukraine, if it signs this document, to adhere to NATO policy in general. That, of course, is moving NATO, at least de facto, right to the center of Ukraine. So the military component, though it's not discussed in Western media commentary, is part of this whole agreement.
Mark, 100 years ago was the start of the First World War, and I'm not prone to hyperbole, but, you know, what happens when neither side blinks?
Well, then we know. And of course, we still have a potential nuclear confrontation. It's unlikely to come to that, but I think we have to be prepared for the fact that if you are essentially pursuing a policy of going for the jugular of the Russian state, you're trying to disintegrate it, you're de facto supporting the Chechen and other separatists inside Russia, then there must be a risk that something unintended will happen. After all, in 2008, Georgia perhaps didn't intend to kill a dozen Russian peacekeepers, but it did, and that precipitated a real crisis. Who knows if there aren't people who may go over the edge in the Ukraine and do something to attack Russian servicemen in Sevastopol, for instance, which could begin to spiral out of control. And I'm afraid because Western public opinion has been so prepared, not just by the newspapers and the news media, but by popular culture, by disc jockeys sniggering at Putin as a terrible bogeyman, we would have a great difficulty in restraining our opinions, just as I'm afraid to say in the jingoistic world of 1914. Every public could be persuaded that they were about to be attacked by a dangerous country, even though each person was being defensive, and yet somehow or other they all managed to be fighting a war to grab territory from each other.
All right, let me jump in here. Stephen Cohen, I want to give you the last word. If you could talk to President Obama about this, what would you tell him? 30 seconds.
I would tell him we need a new American policy toward Russia, that the march on Moscow has to stop, and that the opportunities for cooperation that would benefit our national security are enormous, and he is wasting those opportunities.
All right, gentlemen, thank you for a fascinating debate. Many thanks to my guests in New York and in London, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
believe that this will not continue. I love you.